Now we're ready to display the object that the user actually selects on the screen rather than the turkey. As you can see, I'm now streaming my actual device because we're going to need the camera. And I've once again disabled yellow boxes by uncommenting this line because they were getting in the way of the button. So just as a quick test, I'm going to try adding a turkey again to make sure everything was working properly. And there you have it. I clicked add turkey and we got a turkey added right there. So in order to keep track of the user selection, we're going to add a new state variable, and we'll call this one current asset. And that's going to be the 3D asset that the user has currently selected. And rather than defaulting this to an empty object, why don't we default it to the turkey object, so that way before the user has even done a search, they'll have an object that they can add to their screen. I'm also going to delete these two state properties because we recently extracted them into the searchable Google Poly asset list. I'll save that. And we need to set our current asset whenever it is chosen from the search menu. So if we come down here, this is where our searchable Google Poly asset list is, and we need some way for this component to tell us when an asset has been chosen. And if you recall when we created the Google Poly asset component, we gave it an onPress function, so we can utilize that to determine when an asset has been pressed. So let's come into our searchable Google Poly asset list component, and let's make a new property, and this one will be called onAssetPress. And we'll initialize that to a function that doesn't do anything. Let's scroll down to our renderCurrentResults function and call the onAssetPress function anytime an asset is pressed. So if we'll open this up, and here's where we're adding our Google Poly assets. Let's format the text just a little bit, add some line breaks in there to make it a little bit easier to see when these properties start getting pretty long. Oops. And we want to implement the onPress function for the Google Poly asset, and we want to call this .props.onAssetPress. But we run into a problem, which is this is running in a loop and we need to know exactly which asset was pressed. So why don't we come up here and why don't we add an asset here to indicate that this function will take an asset, and we'll come back into our Google Poly asset function, and the onPress will also provide us with an asset. And when the onPress is pressed here, what it's actually going to do is call this .props.onPress, and it's going to give it this .props.asset. So whenever a Google Poly asset is pressed, it's going to call its onPress function and give this asset object right here as an input. So we'll save that and come back into our searchable Google Poly asset list. Now we need to implement the onPress for the other Google Poly assets that we've added. Let's add a few line breaks here to make it a little easier to read. And we'll put onPress here. And onPress here. Let's save that. All right, as you recall, we're currently adding the object in the onAddTurkeyPress button, and we're assigning the object to a variable called this.turkey. Since it won't always be a turkey, I think we should rename our function and our object. So why don't we name the variable to this.3model equals object, and let's check where that's being used. I think it's being used in onRender. This is where we're rotating it. So instead of this.turkey, we'll say this.3model. And instead of onAddTurkeyPress, why don't we say onAddObjectPress, and come down here, and instead of saying add turkey, we'll say add object and call onAddObjectPress. And in the Google Poly.getThreeModel function call, instead of passing in turkey object, what we're actually going to do is pass in the current asset. So we'll say this.state.currentAsset, and since we initialize it to the turkey object, we can be sure that it will always have some sort of object in it. I'm going to delete this console.log that says adding turkey because we're no longer adding a turkey. And let's review. When we click add object, it will call this and it will load the asset that we currently have. And actually one thing that we need to do is whenever this is pressed, we need to remove the current object. So one way of doing that is by saying this.scene.remove, and we want to remove this.3model. So you can only have one 3 model on the scene at a time. And we'll check if this actually exists. So if this.3model, then we will remove it. So that way, if they click add object and it adds a turkey, and then they go and search for something else and click add object again, it'll first remove that turkey and then add the new object that they want to add. Let's also close the modal anytime an asset is chosen from the search. So we'll come down to our onAssetPress function in the home screen. And after setting the asset, we're also going to set state search modal visible equal to false. So let's save this and test it out. All right, so I'll hold my phone up and press add object, which should give us the turkey by default. If we look around a little bit, there's the turkey. Now let's do a search, and how about we search for duck? And there's the turkey, we don't want to use that. How about we take this penguin, and if we click add object, you can see the turkey goes away and the penguin gets loaded in.